Welcome to Dr. Piercy's Connections in a Servlet Application. In this video, we'll review the deployment descriptor, otherwise known as the web.xml file. We will review how we connect to the JSPs in our Eclipse dynamic web project, and we will see where servlet information is stored in an Eclipse dynamic web project. Before we begin, here are some important terms that we'll need to know. The deployment descriptor, otherwise known as the web.xml file. This is a file that contains application configuration data using the XML format. URL mapping. A mapping is a pointer to a location of a file in a URL format. Root is the primary starting point for any dynamic web application. All URL mappings within an application are relative to the root folder. In Eclipse projects, the root folder is the web content folder. A welcome file is a file that is opened by default when only the application URL is used in a request. We'll see how these terms are used as we create a simple Eclipse dynamic web project. And let's put some of these terms in context as we run an Eclipse project. So you're sitting at your desk, ready to browse to my website. You'll type in my URL, which will send the first request to my website. In this example, you type in only the URL to the site. You do not add any file specifications at the end. My Tomcat web server will receive this request. My Tomcat will spin up an instance of the application, and the first thing it will do is open up the web.xml file to get configuration information. Some of this points to what we know as the welcome file. Perhaps the index file is named index.html, so that will be what is pulled up on the first request and sent back as the first response. You'll look over that page. Maybe you'll find something interesting that you want to see. Perhaps you'll click on a hyperlink, or you'll fill out a form and click the submit button, so a later request will be sent back to my web server. This time, however, you'll have my URL, but you'll also be pointing to another page. Notice in this request, page2.jsp is just one level down from the root, so this would be stored in our root folder or the web content folder. The web server will look in the web content folder for the JSP file. It will look into the file and run any Java code and perhaps spin up any Java POJOs that are necessary to create that response. So in this case, the URL mapping is very clear. It's just directly to a file that is located in the web content folder. Once the response is created, it will be sent back to you, and you'll see it on your web browser. Again, you might see something interesting and you'll want to click on a hyperlink or submit a form. This time, however, the request will go to something different. This time, it will go to something that is a URL mapping. This is a pointer that starts at the root and points to something else that's part of my application. The web server will receive this, it will interpret the URL mapping, it will find what is requested. Perhaps that's a servlet. Servlets are actually stored in our Java source folder. As a servlet runs, it may also call up other POJOs. Eventually the servlet may either send back the response or pass execution on to a JSP file to handle the view response. We are going to look at three things in relation to this diagram. We're going to see how the web XML file can be configured to point to index.html as the welcome file. We'll create a simple JSP page. We'll see how we can add a link to index.html so that the next request will go to page2.jsp. Finally, we'll create a servlet and its URL mapping. We'll note where the URL mapping information is stored within the servlet, and then we'll see how we can connect our page2.jsp to this URL mapping. Let's first start by creating a simple Eclipse dynamic web project. Here we are in Eclipse, and as usual, I'm going to start a new Eclipse dynamic web project. So I'll click File, New, and I'll select Dynamic Web Project from my list. As I often mention to students, be very careful and fill out all of the dialog boxes correctly Instead of hitting finish after the first one, be sure to page through and check every page. In this example, it's very important that we go to the last page so we can generate the web.xml file. I'll call mine Connections Demo. Project location looks to be in the right place in my workspace. I'm going to use Apache Tomcat version 7, along with the dynamic web module version of 3.0. The other items are not that important to check this time, but I will go to Next Page. The other items are not that important to adjust at this time, so I'm going to go to the next page. Here we see that our project will use the SRC or source folder for our Java classes. So let's navigate to the next page in the dialog. And here we're configuring where the actual root folder is going to be. Notice the content directory will be our web content. It's part of our Connections demo. So this shows the application that we've created and the root directory. Notice also the generate web.xml deployment descriptor. If you do not select this, one will be created, but it will be a default one that you won't be able to edit nor see. So let's go ahead and check this box so that we can create that and have a look at the web.xml file. I'll now select Finish and we'll watch what happens. Now over in the Project Explorer window, we can see that my Connections demo project has been created. If I expand this, I can see all the different folders. Web content will be my root folder where I'll put all the web items. Java resources, if I expand that, I can see the source folder. This will be where I put all the Java-based components of my application. You'll note that there's also this item called deployment descriptor. So I'm going to double click, and after a moment the editor window shows our web.xml file. Note that there are two ways to view this file. At the bottom left corner you'll see two tabs. One says Source, which is how we're viewing it now. The other says Design. If I click on that, I see the same information, it's just in a tabular format. I can expand this and see a welcome file list. Turns out that I can actually edit this file from either Design or Source, so use which one is most appropriate for you. For this video, I'll tend to use the Source view. The first thing to note is that this is an XML format. XML uses tags that are similar to HTML, except for they describe the meaning of the content that they mark up, rather than the structure. Notice our display name. This is what Eclipse looks at to display the name of your project. Notice currently there is also a welcome file list. This is a default list. So if you do nothing to web.xml, but you create one of these file names in the web content folder, that will be the one that opens up by default if only your URL is requested. I usually like to clean this up, so I'm going to end up using index.html as my file. So let's just delete all the others. So based on what we have left, when the server comes to my application with only a request to my domain name, the server will spin up the web.xml file. Not a lot of configuration here, but it will note that the welcome file is index.html. It will then look in the web content folder to find a file called index.html, and that is the one that will run to start the application. So let's create an index.html file to see how that will work. New HTML file, web content. Note I need to change the name. I want it to match my welcome file. Hit next. Use that as my HTML. Let's make the title Connections Demo. Let's also add that as a headline to the body. And let's put a simple paragraph that says something like welcome. This is a very simple page with only a title, a headline, and a simple paragraph. In general, you'll want to always put your welcome file just within the web content. Any subsequent files could be stored in subfolders. In the spirit of writing a few things and testing often, let's go ahead and test this on the server. Before we do, what should we expect to see? As I run this on my Tomcat server, the server should spin up. I can note that down here in the server window. The server should then look at the web.xml file and note that the welcome file is index.html. The server will then look within the web content folder and it will find the index.html file. Since it is HTML file, it will simply pass this on as the response back to the browser, which will render the page for us. So now that we have a welcome file, let's add a simple JSP page that we'll call page2.jsp. To get it to run, we'll add a hyperlink to our welcome page that we can click on to run page2.jsp. So back in Eclipse, we have our Eclipse project, and our welcome file index.html is located within the web content folder. I'd like to add a simple JSP file that we can link to from this welcome page. Since a JSP file is mostly webby in nature, we'll put that in our web content folder. I will right-click on Web Content, New, and I'll pick JSP file. I'm going to call this one Page2 for lack of a better name, .jsp. Check through my dialogues. Once I'm satisfied, I create the page. Notice this page is still within my web content root folder. Mark it up a little bit here. Copy from the first page a title and a few things so we know we went to the second one. Let's add page 2 and the title and headline. You made it to page 2. Since it is in the root folder, the URL was simply page2.jsp. Before I can run this, I need to go to index and I need to add something that will allow a request to go to the page 2. This could be several things. I'm going to use a hyperlink. Let's save and see this in action. A good habit is to delete the server if it's not a production server, since we're just testing on it. Now we'll run on server. This time in Chrome, I should see my home page again, but this time there's a go-to page hyperlink. I can click on this, and it should pull up page 2. Next, let's add a simple servlet to our project. So in this case, off of page 2, we need somehow to generate a request that will go to the servlet instead. So how can we write the appropriate URL to get to the servlet? Let's see that in Eclipse. As you know, servlets are Java, so we'll store those in the source folder of our Java web application. I'm going to right-click on source. I like to keep mine a little bit more organized, so I'm going to create a package. I'm going to call it controllers because servlets are generally used as a controller for web applications. Once I have that package, I'm going to right-click and I'm going to create a servlet. Let's just call this the connection demo servlet. Note the class name on the first dialog. It's located in the Java package, and also this class name down here just echoes back what I typed in. Go to the next page. I see on this page some information about the servlet. I'm going to fill out the description, a simple demo of the servlet connections. I'm also going to change the URL mapping. Remember, the URL mapping is like a pointer that says, relative to the root, how do we get to the thing we want to get to? So if we have a mapping, we can call up the mapping and it will direct the servlet to the right place. By default, the URL mapping is the same as our class. I generally like to edit it to make it a little bit more user-friendly. So I'm just going to change this to do servlet. Note that you'll want to keep the slash when you edit this URL mapping. The slash generally indicates that you're starting at the root of your application. We should see our connection demo servlet has been generated. After expanding, the first thing you might do is look through the servlet file to see what has been created for us. One of the things you'll note is this @WebServlet. This is something in Java known as an annotation. The specifics of annotation is beyond what we'll be talking about. Needless to say, this is where the information about this servlet and how to connect to it is stored directly in your servlet. In older versions of Tomcat and Java, this information was stored in the web.xml file. As you look along the line, you'll see that the description that I typed in is noted here, followed by any URL patterns. I used just one. If I had added some initialization parameters, those would also be listed here. So in this case, when the project is built, the server will look through any servlets and it notes this annotation. It will understand and it will save in its memory that any call to do servlet, it needs to come and run this file. So let's add some code to it so it will do something. Let's just work with the get. I'm going to add code to my do get so that this will display a simple message back to the browser. In this case, my servlet is going to act as a controller and a view component. The controlling part won't do much except just run the code. The view part will be printing output to our response object. In order to do that, I need a couple lines of code. I cheated a little bit by copying these into my clipboard. What these two lines do, for the response object, I set the content type so that it's the appropriate content type for a web browser to interpret, and I'm creating a print writer. Notice my print writer has an error. If I highlight this in Eclipse, I can see a list of quick fixes, and because I know what to do, I'm going to import this from the Java I/O package. What we've done is we've created an object that will pretty much write output directly to the response. I'm going to just go ahead and type in some things very quickly without talking much, so follow along as best you can, or review this later to see what's going on. When I'm finished, I will discuss what I have typed in. Okay, I believe this page is set. Again, I created some type of output object that will send output directly to the response. Then basically using out.println commands, I have output all of the HTML tags and content that I want to view on the web page. The basic HTML structure. I included a title called Connection Demo Servlet Page. I echoed that also in a headline within the body. Created a quick paragraph that says where you're at. And then I added an HTML link that will say Start Over. And once you click on it, it will go to index.html. Note I did not need a path because the root of my application is index.html. Now to get this servlet to run, we need to add something to the page2.jsp. In page 2, let's simply add a hyperlink to our servlet. Now in this case, the hyperlink would generally go to the root, and we need to know how do we get from there to the servlet. But recall, we have set up a URL mapping. The URL mapping pattern says from the root, called do servlet, and then it will run the servlet. Let's make sure everything is saved. I'm going to delete my servlet. Last time I ran under the wrong type. Ran okay though. I'm going to right-click on Connection Demo, Run As, Run on Server. Make sure I select the appropriate server this time. Hit Next and hit Finish. What should happen is my server will run. It will hit the web.xml file to find out what the appropriate welcome file is. You notice the only URL was to my Connections Demo application. Because index.html was the welcome file, it didn't have to be specified in the URL. I can then click on the reference to go to page 2, which is page2.jsp. It's also in the root, so the URL is connections demo page2.jsp. We see that we're at the right place. Now I can click on my go to servlet link. This is not in the root, but there's a mapping from the root to my servlet, and it was just the do servlet mapping. So when I click on this, it has now taken us to our connection demo servlet page. So in this video, we have seen the deployment descriptor and how we can use it to specify our welcome file. We've also seen how we can connect to the JSPs in our Eclipse dynamic web project. And we've also seen where servlet information is stored and how we can connect to the servlets. For further information, please check out the references noted here. This video was written, narrated, and produced by Dr. Craig A. Piercy. Background music is DC 3000 by Thievery Corporation from the Wired CD Rip Sample Mass Share 2004. This has been a Piercy production.